Good morning, good Chodesh, Chodesh Tov, everybody. This is Rabbi Sayani, and this is going to be a shiur on Parsha Matos-Masei, which was the Parsha that we were fortunate to read yesterday for Shabbos. It's the last Parsha in Sefer Bamidbar in the Book of Numbers. And of course, we begin the shiur by dedicating it to those that are in need of refuah shlema, especially Chaya Basia Bas Zipporah, and to Italea Bas Fredel, who was in the hospital in the past week. Also, Ule Nishmas, all of the members of the shul who were nifter in the previous year, Stephen Wimpheimer and Eddie Gelber, and Ruby Cohen, Robin Safer, Janice Marcus, all of our members, who are nifter. This should be the nishmas, the neshama should have an aliyah, and also anybody who needs a refuah shlema, we daven that they should have a refuah shlema b'karov. So we're going to look at the role of really the Nesiim, the role of the tribal leaders, and what can this teach us about Jewish leadership? What is the proper way to really be of service to the Jewish people? After 40 years of wandering and traveling throughout the Midbar and the desert, the Jews were camped on the bank of the Jordan River of the Yarden, and it was time for Hashem to delineate the exact borders of Eretz Yisrael and to present a plan for its distribution among the 12 Shvatim, among the 12 tribes. In our Parsha, Hashem laid out the boundaries of the land and specified precisely how and who would distribute the land. The distribution would take place after the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, so the first thing that Hashem did was assign responsibility to the rightful successors of Moshe and Aaron, who were Elazar, the Kohen Gadol, right? Elazar was the son of Aaron. He was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And to Yehoshua ben Nun, Yehoshua was Moshe Rabbeinu's chief Talmud, his chief disciple, his protege, the successor to whom really the authority would be passed on. They would divide the area of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, into 12 sections, and they would throw lots. This is in Bamidbar, Perek, Lamed, Daled, Psukim, Yud Zayin to Yud Tes, Numbers chapter 34, verses 17 to 19. Eli Shemot Chanashim Asher Nichalu Lachem Et Haaretz, Elazar HaKohen v'Yeshua ben Nun. These are the names of the men who will inherit the land for you, Elazar the Kohen and Yehoshua ben Nun, Joshua the son of Nun. Nasi echad mimate tikulin chol et haaretz. Take one prince from each tribe to help you acquire the land. Ele shemot hanashim lamate Yehuda Caleb ben Yefune. These are the names of the men for the tribe of Judah. Caleb the son of Yefune. The Torah proceeds to list the names of each nasi, of each tribal prince, but they're not so relevant necessarily to this discussion. We're going to focus less on who they were and more on the role that they played. So Elazar and Aaron administered the casting of lots, like a lottery. And their role seems to be straightforward. Right? So what was the role of the Nesiim, of the tribal princes? It would seem that they drew the lots on behalf of their tribes. And this is actually something that Rashi tells us directly already 8 chapters earlier. Rashi on Bamidbar, Perek Chaf Vav, Pasuk Nun Daled, chapter 26, verse 54 says as follows. Rashi there says, V'shvatim chayev tuvim b'shneim asar p'takim, v'yud beis gvulin v'yud beis p'takim. V'alvim b'kalpi, v'chanasi machnis yadu l'tochi v'notei shneim p'takim, ole v'yadu petek shel shem shivto, petek shel gevel chameforash lo. that the names of the Shvatim, the names of the tribes, were inscribed on 12 slips. And the 12 territories had another 12 slips. They mixed them in a box, and the prince of each tribe placed his hand inside and drew out 2 slips. In his hand came a slip bearing the name of his tribe and a slip inscribed with the territory designated for it. Here, in this parak, in this chapter, Rashi presents an entirely different role. Here, in our parak on Pasuk Yud Zayin, verse 17, Rashi here says, "Asher yinchalu lachem bishvilchem kol nasi v'nasi apotropos l'shivto u'mechalek mechalet hashevet l'mishpachot v'ligvarim v'or l'chol echad v'echad chelek hagun, who will inherit the land for you." For you means on your behalf. That each prince was an administrator for his tribe to divide the tribal inheritance among families and individuals, and he chose a suitable portion for each one. שאם כן, היה לו לכתוב ינחילו לכם, ינחלו משמע שכם נוכלים לכם בשבילכם ובמקומכם כמו השם ילכם לכם. We can't translate lachem, which means for you, in the plural, for yous, basically, as to you. Lachem, we can't translate it as to you, because in that case, the Torah would not read, inherit the land for you, but bequeath the land to you. The word inherit implies that they inherit for you on your behalf and in your place, such as the passage in Shemot that we have, Exodus chapter 14, verse 14, Adonai lechem lechem, God will wage war for you. So this is a surprising Rashi. It's a surprising interpretation. And before we saw this Rashi, we would have assumed that, the princes drew the lots. Now we learn that their role was to determine precisely which plot of land was suitable for each family and person, right? That's a role that requires more wisdom, more chokhmah, more sensitivity, really, just more of an overall effort and more of an overall involvement than just casting lots. Right now, you have to take into account people's needs and unique circumstances, and there's much of a greater achrayus here, more responsibility. Right, casting lots is meant to sort of be a process very blind to these subjective needs and realities. Right, you cast lots, it operates on a very sort of cut and dry basis of statistics and probability. You get what you get and you don't get upset, basically. Whereas, now, there seems to be more to it really than that. So does it make sense to us that this should be decided by fiat, which then becomes sort of binding law, right? It seems to maybe be a little intrusive, right? Maybe each family could be trusted on their own to determine what kind of land suited them. It might have made more sense, maybe for each mishpacha, each family, to inform the nasi prince what kind of land they felt was suitable, and the nasi, the prince, would do his best to accommodate. So what is this business really of sort of dividing for the people? Does the nasi know best? Does the bureaucrat know best rather than the people to do, what's good for them? We live in a country where, our society certainly is one where, we kind of recoil at that. We live in a society where people have, sort of very individualist impulses or libertarian impulses to some extent, in which, people in our country take great umbrage at what they consider to be government overreach. In many ways. We're a very divided country socially, politically, etc. And certainly, this is a trope that comes up in different ways, right? On the left, people will often say, sort of like, my body, my choice. We don't want the government involved in making healthcare decisions for us. And people on the right, for instance, will very often, claim that, government programs or taxes or whatever, constitute an imposition. You know, People have a sense that they want autonomy, and they want, they want to feel like the government is not being a nanny state, right? People don't like, in general, feeling micromanaged. Um, let alone by the government. People don't like feeling micromanaged. They don't like, uh, you know, the sense of, the elite or plutocrats or bureaucrats, really exerting too much of an influence in lives. Um, right? Because such a model of government, it assumes that people are incapable of knowing what's best for themselves. Now, in many cases, people may not know what's best for themselves, or just due to the weaknesses of human nature, or even just the weaknesses really of neurochemistry or neuroanatomy, um, or cognition, we know that people are often prone to do certain things, right? It's a great discussion. Um, we kind of look at the role maybe of heuristics, right? Heuristics in cognitive processing, right? People, it just seems to be sort of ingrained, even on a brain level, like in terms of our learning, our cognition, that we often sort of default to these cognitive shortcuts that reinforce biases and reinforce behaviors that may be harmful or less than ideal. Um, you know, from you could use that information in one of two ways, right? The government may want to use that kind of information to promote wellness, let's say, by using sort of strategic product placement or messaging or things like that. People that want to sell you candy bars or alcohol or cigarettes or whatever, they know how to use heuristic processing to get people to buy these things, right? So it's sort of a chair of a sword that can go both ways. Now, who appointed though these Nisim to do this, right? Did the tribes appoint their Nisim, their princes, to decide where they would live and what kind of houses they would build, right? It seems to be a bit of an overreach, much more involved than just having the simple role of drawing the lot for the tribe. The people, why weren't the people tasked with dividing up the land among themselves? Um, so first of all, how did Rashi know about this role in the first place? Right. So this sort of bureaucratic additional type role, right, of the Nisim being so involved that they're involved, being so involved in people's lives that they're the ones making these decisions. So the verse just talks about inheriting the land, which we can easily interpret and limit to the first role of drawing lots on the tribe's behalf. So how did Rashi know about this second role? So let's look at sort of the hekesh or the juxtaposition of things in the verses. So the tribal princes, the Nisim, are introduced in the same passage as Elazar and Joshua, Yehoshua, which must be significant. So there has to be something in common. What qualities were there in common between these tribal leaders and these national leaders? Or or how do we understand this within the broader context of leadership? So one of the models of leadership or taxonomies of leadership we could look at, interestingly, here is discussed by the Rebbe. Lubavitcher Rebbe discusses this in Makute Sichot, and he offers a unique insight. He says, "The tafkido shel nasi kol shevet lidog lezarchei anshe shivto yesh shnei inyanim." That there are two distinct elements to this role of the nasi, of the tribal prince, to provide for the shevet, to provide for his tribe. Tafkido mitzad b'nei Yisrael shehu כשלוחם לכל זרעיכם בהצטרפותם, that he was the proxy of the Jewish people and his tribe to provide for all their needs. Tafkido mitzad Hashem, Al Yidei Moshe Rabbeinu, and he was the divinely appointed leader, appointed by Moshe Rabbeinu, intended to be in that role by God. The Chashem Moshe Rabbeinu nitman me'et Adonai, the Rosh Masei Klali Shel Kol Yisrael ve'acharav Yeshua ben Nun Yismach Mani et Ha'edah, Al Yidei Moshe b'tzivo Hashem, הדרג זה הוא בנוגע לנשיא ראש פרטי של כל שבט, שהתמנותו באה מהקדוש ברוך הוא על ידי ציווי למשה רבנו נשיא כל ישראל, that Hashem obviously appoints Moshe Rabbeinu. He appoints Moses as leader of the nation, of the Jewish people, succeeded by Joshua, whom Moshe appointed as leader at God's behest. And similarly, Hashem, through his Sivoy, through his commands, his instructions to Moshe, he ordained each Nasi, each tribal prince, the leader of his nation. So the first role can be compared to the leaders we elect or appoint, right? They're not divinely ordained and don't have the mandate to influence our personal lives. But the second role is different. As divinely appointed leaders, they're sort of channeling Hashem's leadership. And just as Hashem we believe that just as Hashem is sort of intimately involved in daily affairs, these leaders were intended to model that sort of divine attribute or that divine quality. That such leaders would not just be concerned with sort of big picture items that we would ask governments to take care of, right? That it shouldn't be, just, for defense and police and things like that, but to have a more intimate and involved role. And similarly, in this role, Moshe and Yehoshua and the tribal leaders, they did have a role to play in everybody's personal life. And so, continues, the Rebbe Likkutei Sichos, he says that Tafkidu mitzad b'nei Yisrael hu be'ikar lidog avur zarchei haklal v'hatzibur, v'chanocheg sheba'olam shekol kibush shel anashim yemanim rosh umanig lidog avur zarchim הכלליים דהכלל, שכל אחד ואחד מן הקיבוץ תלוי בצרכיו וענייניו הפרטיים. So his role as a proxy of his tribe is primarily to worry about the communal needs of the collective whole. And says the Rebbe, this is consistent with the practice really in every country where people gather in one way or another to appoint leaders who provide for their general needs while each individual should provide for their own personal needs. Masha ain't came Nuyev Kadosh Baruch Hu can see Israel between Nasi Uba'avim, or is Zegam Benogel is Archeprat. Excuse me, Harry from Nasi Chorach Shokov Zivu Elishokol Echad Vechad Gam Beto Yachid. However, his role as a Jewish leader by divine ordination, as God had declared it, also pertains to the needs of the individual, that he's not just the leader of the collective whole, but also the leader of every individual. So we see from this that really the tribal leaders, they played a dual role, that there was an administrative role, but also a more pastoral role. And in a certain sense, that's really what even being a rabbi often entails, right? We do things administratively and we also do things pastorally. So, I have to be adept at, using technology to teach. And Baruch Hashem, in our shul, we don't really put too much non-religious things on the rabbi, which is really nice. I've worked as a mashgiach, as a kosher supervisor in a synagogue in Manhattan. I'm not going to say which one. The rabbi was basically, part of the rabbi's job was that he had to put out the kiddush. The rabbi was essentially the kiddush committee. And I remember working in the synagogue on a Friday afternoon. And rather than the rabbi, 2 hours before Shabbos being involved, in, helping unfortunately, rather than him helping his wife make Shabbos or helping his kids get ready for Shabbos, or rather than him getting some learning in or, really attending to, things of that nature, he was concerned with organizing food deliveries and plating it up and putting stuff in the warmers and, attending to all of these, more mundane affairs, which, In other synagogues, you'd have sort of a Kiddush committee that deals with these things. Um, and I asked him about this, and he says, "Yeah, you got to make a living somehow." I joked to him. I said, "Too bad in Smicha they didn't teach us about." I joked to him. I said, "Too bad in Smicha they didn't teach us these things, right? They didn't teach us, they didn't teach us the best way to put sesame chicken in a warmer over Shabbos to keep it from drying out." Um, in other arenas, I see rabbis also really having such. I'm very blessed to be part of Clearview, where you don't really burden me with these things. I see in other places, other shuls, the rabbi has to know about the HVAC system, and he has to know about plumbing, and he has to know which contractor should be hired, and he has to know about what floor tiles are needed. He has to be a handyman. He has to be a handyman, a property manager, a bookkeeper, um, payroll expert. He has to know human resource. Other shuls, the rabbi just gets bogged down and burdened with things that really have nothing, to do with the training we're given. Um, so you run into that, the administrative end. But the Nasiim also played a pastoral role, and this is really the strength of, again, not necessarily a role that even rabbis classically, were trained for, fit into, but we see that even within Jewish leadership, going all the way back to the beginning here, at least manifesting in Parshas Matos-Masei, you know, this idea of sort of being, chaplain or quasi-therapist, that part of what it means to be a Jewish leader. We see this going back to we see these qualities demonstrated by most of them, and I realize more and more, and I think that maybe we're even starting to realize that it's a part of rabbinic training we need to really emphasize more. That, classically, um, by classically, I mean maybe until like 100 somewhat years ago, right? Rabbi meant teacher, and specifically, it meant that it was somebody who was trained and tested in specific areas of Jewish law and had the competency to deal with questions of Jewish law. So the rabbi was the person who would, be the voice of authority when it came to things such as, is this chicken, you slaughter a chicken, is the chicken a treifa or not? Um, you know, is a mara meaning, um, a white cloth that women use around that time of the month when they're menstruating to see if it's staining that would make the woman nida or not. Rabbi would make it determine permissible or not, pure or impure. Or the rabbi would be there to make decisions in terms of people's food at home, right? The person accidentally uses a dairy spoon like a milk galefala to stir a meat pot, right? You ask the rabbi what to do in these cases, but you know, it just by the very nature of the human reality, a rabbi is also like a shepherd, like, right? We call one of the things we say the Moshe Rabbeinu, Roe Neman. We're going to see this term thrown out later in more sources. He's referred to that in the Midrash and other places. Aramaic, in the Zohar and the Kabbalah, they specifically use the term in Aramaic, Raya Mehemna. Um, and for me, at least, that is a model and a very deep and important understanding of what it means to be a rabbi. That people will have questions of halacha. The wall outside of my office, is a testament to the fact that I got trained and tested and certified to deal with these things, right? Yora means, the person is competent to deal with matters of Jewish law that pertain specifically to kashrut. Um, my case, I also have the training to be a Masada Kedushin, so to deal with things that are pertinent to weddings and marriages. Rav Kehila, which is very important for the way shuls function, to be trained in the issues that come up in a synagogue, specifically around the minyan and prayer and Torah reading and things of that nature. Very grateful to have these training experiences, but we recognize nowadays that many people expect the rabbi to be a rebbe, to be a pastoral counselor in a sense, and to really have that training. And for me, I've taken nine credits of graduate level coursework in mental health counseling, in addition to having recently completed an undergraduate degree in psychology. Having that background is very important for clergy in general, and we emphasize this more nowadays, because more often than not, especially in a community such as ours, where most people are not generally observant of halakha, people nonetheless have struggles and challenges in their lives for which they need empathy and warmth and love and support offered from within the perspective of Jewish wisdom. So they channeled these Nisim, they channeled and embodied Hashem's concern for every person's needs. Rav Chaim Brisker, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, brilliant Talmud Chacham, he commented on the role of the Rav, and it's funny, in Brisk, so Rav Chaim Brisker, one of the greatest, scholars we ever produced of Gemara, of Talmud, in his city, though, there actually was a dayan, there was a rabbi who dealt with questions of Jewish law, wasn't Rav Chaim Brisker. But, he commented even then that the role of a rabbi is really to be involved in people's needs, that it's to look after the orphans, the widows, the converts, the vulnerable people, and so forth. And a great story that's often used to model this is, there was a woman who asked him, can she use milk for the 4 cups of the Passover Seder for Arba Kosos? Could she use milk because she was too poor to afford grape juice and wine? And his response was not to look at this from the perspective of the letter of the law. Of course, from the letter of the law, one cannot fulfill that mitzvah with milk. But his response was, well, we have to get this woman food and money, because if she's asking if she could use milk for the Seder, it means that she doesn't have a chicken to put on the table for the Seder. So to be concerned for people's everyday needs and private needs is something that a Jewish leader, a rabbi, needs to be involved in, to take an interest in people's lives. And I really do like to have an interest in people's lives, and to be there to help within the boundaries of what people are comfortable with. Very, very important, I think, is to respect the boundaries of what people are comfortable with, because there could be a fine line at a certain point where people feel like it's micromanaging, and that could become what we call a cult. Coming back here, right, we see that these tribal leaders, these Nisim, these princes, they also became involved in the personal affairs of their people, their constituents, because Hashem appointed them to stand in his place and to help with the tribe's individual needs. And it was within that context that they allocated suitable pieces of land for the families and individuals of their tribes. And of course, they also did the administrative thing, right? They were appointed by the tribe to act on their behalf and provide for communal concerns, right? They were representatives of the people. So, for instance, when the Jews made camp in the desert, these princes, they were responsible for digging a channel from the central well, let's say the bear that traveled with the Jews to the tribal encampment. So they're involved in, those very practical concerns, but also the pastoral concerns as well. These two roles are delineated in the two passages that describe the involvement of the tribal leaders, right? The second passage is in Pasuk Yudches, verse 18, right? What did verse 18 say? It said, "V'nosi echad nosi echad mimate tichul nichol et haaretz." Take one prince from each tribe to help you to acquire the land. Right? That says that they helped their tribes acquire the land, referring to sort of the generic role that they played in their tribe's communal affairs, which namely was drawing the lots that determined where each tribe would settle in the country. Right? The first Pasuk Yud Zayin, verse 17 says, Asher yinchalu lachem et haaretz, that they will inherit the land for you. It refers to the role that they played in each person's life. So how do we know that? Because this added role appears in this passage, in this verse, alongside the names of Elazar and Yehoshua, right? Et haaretz, Elazar HaKohen, Yeshua ben Nun. It's instructive. It tells us that the role of the princes in this passage is similar to that of Joshua. That just as Joshua was divinely ordained, so were the princes. And we now know how Rashi knew about and the nature of the tribal leaders' added role, that if the role in the passage derives from their divine ordination, it follows that it was to assist individuals with their personal concerns. The Rebbe continues in the Kutei Sichot. He says, "Mizeh she'atei v'doshem yichalu lachem shkayel al hanisim keniskar la'el." It's a Elazar Yoshua. Lamed Rashi from Medubar benachla kizol cheshaychet b'tafkidan shozeh nisim shel b'sud minuyim shel Elazar Yoshua. That the words "inherit for you," which refer to the tribal princes, appear in the same passage as the names of Elazar and Joshua. From this, Rashi inferred that the prince's role in the land distribution referenced in this passage was related to the leadership capacity that they shared with Elazar and Yoshua. The Hayinu Kishim Shibinagela of Yeshua Hayminuim Meyuchad Mehet Hashem. Velodai Bezeh Shalazar Hu Kohen Gadol Yeshua Hu Rosh Haidah. Shemizeh Muvan Shehem Mimanu Kan Kebalim. Al Inyan Nachlat Haaretz Kemo Chayin Hu Benogea Linsei Hashvatim. Shahaya kan minoi meyuchad v'shayach b'tafkidam kivalim u'memunim le'inyani b'nei Hashevet, that Hashem explicitly appointed Elazar and Yoshua to administer the land allocation. This was a new appointment separate from their roles as high priest and national leader. And the same is true of the tribal princes, that Hashem gave them a special appointment related to their roles as responsible for the personal concerns of their people. Their appointment by the people authorized them to receive the tribal lands on behalf of their shevet, on behalf of their tribe. It was a big picture item that the people entrusted them to care for. Then came the allocation of land to each family, which entailed determining each person's needs. Right? It's not in the purview of big government, so to speak. It should be decided on a local level. Yet these princes got involved because they were divinely ordained to do this. Hashem ordained them with a higher responsibility for each individual. Now, though Hashem ordained the Nisim, the tribal princes, with the authority to provide for people's personal needs, it's something that could still be bothersome. Because people have a need for self-sufficiency. People often have a need to feel autonomous, right? People, often feel effective, proficient, needed, and valued when they're able to do for themselves. When the government would swoop in and take over, the message that people would internalize is that they're often too inept to know what's best for themselves and how to make it happen. So why here were the people willing to accept what would seem like intrusiveness from these divinely ordained leaders? So understanding the motivations of these leaders, of these princes, might help us appreciate their involvement. And To understand that, we have to look at the nature of Moshe Rabbeinu, the nature of the leadership, of the authority of Moshe Rabbeinu. There's an episode in the Torah where something Moshe Rabbeinu did is credited to the Jewish people, and something that the Jewish people did is credited to Moshe Rabbeinu. And Rashi wonders why the two are conflated by the Torah, and Rashi explains as follows. This is a bit earlier in Bamidbar. This is in Perek Chaf Aleph, Pasuk Chaf Aleph, 21, chapter 21, verse 21. Here, Rashi says, "Shemoshe Yisrael Yisrael Chei Moshe, V'amar Lecha Shenasi Ador Hu Kechol Ador Ki Hanasi Hu Hakol." That Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu is Klal Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael is Moshe Rabbeinu, which teaches us that the leader of the generation is the entire generation, because the leader is everything. So Rashi says that there's no daylight really between Moshe and the people, that Moshe is the people are Moshe. Therefore, the achievements of one are the achievements of the other. They are not being conflated. They are truly joined as one entity. What does that mean? How can Moshe be the people and the people Moshe? They are different. The answer is that they're different only account on a physical basis, but on a spiritual basis, in spirit, they're one. How does this work? So according to Kabbalah, you have a single soul that emanates from God. Right, so we could look at Adam, let's say, Adam Harishon, right? You have God who created Adam Harishon, the first human being. A single soul emanates from God. It gets implanted within Adam Harishon. Sparks of that soul branch out to form individual souls. Moshe is the original soul from which all the souls of his generation emanate. In differentiated form, each soul is different from the other. Each soul has its own characteristics. However, their connection with Moshe begins before they differentiated. And the Tanya in Igeres HaKodesh, Zion, he explains how they're rooted in this sort of oneness. So says the Alter Rebbe, Kol Neshamot Shebalam Chayu Kilulot Adam Harishon V'Derek Lel. Haytan Yishmato Nechleket L'Mispar Taryag, Ramach Evarim V'Shasa Gidim Ach Derech Prat, Nechleket L'Nitzotzot In Mispar Shehen Nishmot Kol Yisrael Mimot Chalvot, Hashvatim Ad Biat HaMashiach Ve'ad Bichlal Shekuyam Az Ma Shekatuv V'Haya Mispar B'nei Yisrael Kachol Chayam, Asher Lo Yimad V'Lo Yisafer Merov. So says the Tanya that all of the neshamas, call neshamat shabaolam, all of the neshamas in the world were initially incorporated into the neshama of Adam Harishon. And the neshama of Adam Harishon differentiated into 613 general soul segments, which corresponded to 248 limbs and 365 sinews in the human body. Interestingly, we look at the number 613, we say 248 limbs correspond to positive mitzvahs, 365 sinews in the body correspond to negative mitzvahs of the Torah, the do's and the don'ts, the taseh and the lo taseh. Each segment is subdivided into an endless number of specific nitzotzot, soul sparks. And these comprise all of the neshamas, all of the souls of the Jewish people of Klal Yisrael, from the days of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and the 12 tribes until the coming of the Mashiach, till after the coming of the Mashiach, at which time certain prophecies will come true. For instance, we have a prophecy from Hosea that the number of the Jewish people would be like the sand of the sea that can't be measured or counted. That will be numerous, right? These are prophecies that was the prophecy that Hashem gave to Abraham, that we would be numerous in such a way. V'hinei shuvchei de Yaakov mein shuvchei de Adam harishon shetiken chet Adam harishon v'hayta nishmato gam kein kilula kol neshama should be Israel meyad olam v'yad olam. He says, know that Yaakov's soul, the soul of Yaakov Avinu, was also comprised of all of the Jewish souls from the beginning until the end as well. So we see that from the collective neshama, Adam Harishon, from which all of the individual neshamas emerged, that this even had Gilgal, that this even, sort of found its way um, in a transmigration, we could say, for those who believe in, reincarnation. Gilgal and Neshama is not something that we all believe in, but certainly in Kabbalah, this is a very important principle, and that's what this source is conveying. Um, that there was a transmigration or Gilgal of the Neshama of Adam Rishon and Yaakov Avinu. But this didn't end with Yaakov. That after the passing of Yaakov, this neshama was reincarnated into the next Jewish leader, and so on in every generation. That there's always a Jewish leader with the collective soul of Adam Rishon, from which all the individual sparks are differentiated. This person is called a Nasi, the leader of the generation. Interestingly, Nasi, there's an interesting teaching from the Megalia Mukos on Parsha Svayichi. The Megalia Mukot is a work of Kabbalah, written by Rav Nosson Nota Shapiro. And he says that the word Nasi, leader or prince, is actually, it's Rashi Tevis. It's an acronym for something. He says, the Raza Dag Lagola Shahaya Nitzotso Shel Yaakov Avinu L'chein Nikras Stam Nasi B'Gemara. Says that, who do we call Nasi in the Gemara? He looks at the example of Rav Yehuda Hanasi, right? Right, Rav Yehuda Hanasi, of course, Rav Yehuda the prince was one who took the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral Torah, and put it into written form for us, basically. And the Megalia Mukos asks, why is he called Nasi in the Gemara? He says, because it's Rashi Tevis. It's an acronym for Nitzuzo Shel Yaakov Avinu. It's an acronym for a spark of our father Yaakov, of Yaakov Avinu. The Raza de Gilgal. This is by the Raza, the mystery Gilgal of reincarnation. Just as it was with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in the third century, it's also in every generation that there is a Nasi. There is a leader of the Jewish people who they have a desire to be intimately involved in the lives of Klal Yisrael because they are able to empathize, and they're kept up by the suffering of Klal Yisrael. They want that nobody should suffer. And it's rooted in love and care ultimately. And those are the qualities that we should want in leaders and rabbis and things like that. That people would have such care. And this was the litmus test, actually, by which Hashem determined the brilliance of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was the right person for the task. It didn't have to do with his brilliance. It's important to love the Torah on an intellectual basis is very important. We certainly need people, we need great rabbinic authorities that have the intellectual prowess to do that. But ultimately, like when Hashem was giving Moses the interview here, so to speak, Hashem wasn't concerned with the fact that Moshe was brilliant and a scholar and frum. Hashem didn't choose Moshe Rabbeinu to be the great leader or shepherd of his people, of Klal Yisrael, until he saw that Moshe Rabbeinu was empathetic. And when we think about leadership qualities in general, the intellect is important, the head is important, but we see very clearly here that the litmus test was the heart, not the head. That the litmus test that Hashem used to determine if Moshe was suitable for the task of being the greatest prophet. The test came about through a probe of the heart rather than the mind or the head necessarily. And that is ultimately what mattered to Hashem in making such a personal decision, so to speak. Should matter to us also. So the Medrash in Shemos Rabbah, the Midrash gives us the following. The Midrash says, "Keshahaya Moshe Rabbeinu olav Shalom roid so no shel yitro b'midbar. Baruch Menu gediv ratzach harav ad shehigia lachasut. Kivan shehigia lachasut niztamna v'bracha shomayim ve'amad chagdi lishtot. Kivan shehigia Moshe etzlo amar ani lo hayiti yodea shiratzayita mipnei zama ayefata yirkivo al ketefo v'haya mehalech." That when Moshe Rabbeinu, olav Shalom, when he shepherded the sheep of Yitro, Jethro's sheep in the desert, there was a goat in there that got away, that broke away. And Moshe chased the goat until it arrived to a shady area. And when it came in the shade, it found a brook and stopped to drink. And when Moshe arrived, he said, "I didn't know you were running because you're thirsty. You know, poor goat, you're tired." And he carried the goat on his shoulders and walked back to the herd. So the empathy that Moshe Rabbeinu showed as a shepherd, as a good shepherd, as a Raya Mehemna, beautiful. And God saw this. And he said as follows: Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Yesh lecha rachamim linchog sano shel basar v'dam kach chayecha ata tirei tzoni Yisrael. Hashem observed this. The Rebbeinu Shalom saw this and said that if you have such compassion for an animal to provide for a sheep that belong to a human, you know, Hashem said, "I swear that you'll shepherd my sheep, the Jewish people." Right? Moshe Rabbeinu had such pain for this goat, this nebuch goat. He was hurting because the goat was hungry and tired. Right? And this is this is emblematic of true leadership, right? So we saw from the Tanya that sort of you had the collective soul of humanity. It subdivides into a larger number, which then subdivides further into many more souls. And the first tranche of subdivided souls are the regional and local leaders of the Jewish people. In the Midbar, these were the 12 Nesiim that were appointed by Hashem. They were appointed because they were the collective souls from which the individual souls of their tribe members differentiated. Therefore, when the people of their tribe had a need, they felt like it was their need too. They got involved in the personal affairs of their constituents because they cared, because the needs of the constituents were their needs also. And the truth is that to a degree, every Jew has a collective aura in their soul. After all, we are each a product of the collective soul, so if we try hard enough, we can each trace our way back to our roots. When we regress to the initial state, we too can become collective, manifesting in real life as us reaching such a point of empathy that the needs of others become our needs. The Sichos continues, he says, "V'inyan shel hanasi hu l'rak shekol ha'am shome'im bekolo mitnahgim al pi horotav, ela yiteir mizo, hanasi hu hakol, u'me'achar shehanasi hu hakol, מובן שהוא מתייחס לכל אחד ואחד מישראל בשווה. וכמספר בדרשות רבותינו זכרונם לברכה שהקדוש ברוך הוא ניסה את משה רבנו לראות אם הוא מתאים להיות רוען של ישראל על ידי זה שראה את יחסו לשקה שברח מן העדר. That a leader is not just somebody that we obey and follow. Also, the leader is also everything. And if the leader is everything, it follows that the leader has to regard all of Klal Yisrael equally. Chazal taught that Hashem tested Moshe Rabbeinu to see if he was worthy of the Jewish leadership by gauging his regard for the sheep that ran away, which we just saw in the Medrash. Kasher mityachasim lashad chanimsa bitmidut ba'eder ein ze chochach adayin shehu ro'ei ne'eman. Raya Mehemna. אלא דווקא כאשר ישנו מציאות שעושה שברח מן העדר ואף על פי כן משתדל כרועה, רודף אחרי הססה, ומחזירו לעדר זוהי הוכחה שהוא רועה נאמן, אחד שהנהגתו היא באופן השווה ומשווה וכולי בין עשה הנמצא בתמידות בעדר לאשר שברח מן העדר, שזה חותן עד הרועה נאמן. Paying attention to the sheep in the herd, doesn't necessarily prove that we're faithful shepherds. It's only when a sheep flees the herd and we do our best to pursue and bring it back that we prove that we're faithful shepherds. When we regard the sheep that breaks away the same way that we regard those always afoot, it proves that we're faithful shepherds. A good rabbi never gives up on anybody. I saw a movie, a Disney movie that they remake not long ago about Hawaiians, and they were saying that in the Hawaiian and the Polynesian language, Ohana means family, and it means literally that nobody gets left behind. And the the idea is very deeply the idea that no Jew is left behind, the idea that none of us would be left behind because we're a mishpacha, that we're a family, that we're a collective whole, is a very beautiful concept, and we see that playing out here. But al tizeh muvan shenyan ha'achdut the bnei Israel mudgash beyoter etzel Moshe Rabbeinu. This demonstrates that Jewish unity is most pronounced within Moshe Rabbeinu because the leader is everything, that he regards all Jewish people equally. Everybody, that nobody gets left behind. Who would think, who would think that I can make a connection between the Rebbe Sichos and the movie Lilo and Stitch? But here we go. What is true of Moshe Rabbeinu, it's a lesson for every Jew. ועל פי זה מובן שהעניינים המורים בנוגע למשה רבנו הם הוראה לכל אחד ואחד מישראל, איך שאצל כל אחד ואחד מישראל ישנו ניצוץ מנשמת משה רבנו, כאשר הוא שומע ומתנהג על פי הכרעות למשה רבנו שבקרבו, הרי זה אצלו מילתא זוטרתי. This is Milsa Zutrati, that it's explained in many places that there is a spark of Moses, a Moses spark in every Jew. And everything that is said of Moshe Rabbeinu is intended to be a lesson for every Jew. And if there is a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu in each of us, then we should be able to follow the guidance of that Moses spark in each of us. הנהגת משה רבנו, ולכן חרך הוא משתדל לפעול על הזולת באופן האמור ומצד העניין דאהבת ישראל. But this also relates to what we learned from Moshe Rabbeinu about loving our fellow Jews, what we learned about Ahavas Yisrael, that we should regard all of us equally as Moshe Rabbeinu did, whether we're simple or profound, whether it's a Talmud Chacham or somebody simple-minded, somebody religious, observant, somebody who's not, to love all of our fellow Jews equally, and to do our best to encourage every Jew to do more mitzvahs out of love. This is the correct approach. And it's the approach that I've always brought to my work as a rabbi. I always find it funny, people will say, well, I'm not religious. You're Jewish, right? If that's what matters, right? Doesn't matter necessarily what you do. Your worth is predicated on who you are and where you come from. Hopefully, where you're going, we could catch that up and help you catch up and help you explore and deepen your commitment and your connection, right? That's always a good thing, and that's something we hope for. But just by virtue of the fact that you're Jewish, you have a very special calling in this world and a very special purpose. And, we hope and pray that our shul is a place where people could help to really explore what that means, and to live that out into their own lives and carry that into the world in day-to-day lives. I always found it funny. People come to shul week after week. They come to pray and put on a tallis, or they come to daven week after week. Oh, I'm not religious. Well, you're doing better than 88% of American Jews who, nowadays people don't even go to services twice a year. So we always want to do more, but people often feel a sense of guilt or shame or inferiority. You know, um, we want to encourage people to do more out of love. Um, and the Rambam, Maimonides, even says a person should do a mitzvah because they want to do the will of God in this world. They should do a mitzvah because they enjoy doing it, not because they're afraid they're going to burn in hell like a hot dog on the grill afterwards. But a person should want to do mitzvahs, um, and should view doing mitzvahs as containing the primary enjoyment within this world, right? That, person should keep kosher because they believe that this is the diet that Hashem gave us. It connects us to the way our ancestors lived for thousands of years. Not thinking that if you buy Purdue chicken, you're going to burn in hell because of it, right? You know, we're very into encouraging, and the Rambam is very explicit about this idea that um, it has to be rooted in love of God, love of the mitzvah, and that's what we really hope to inculcate, and I certainly hope to inculcate. Um, So you don't have to be a divinely appointed leader to be involved in the private affairs of your brother out of love. We could each do that, we could each avoid, we go back to the story of Cain and Abel, right? Am I my brother's keeper? Yes. We each have access to the collective soul spark within ourselves, the spark of Moshe within us, to be our brother's keeper, to be a force for good in the lives of those around us. And if we tap into this, it's a very good way to feel that love, that concern, that connection, that empathy that Moshe Rabbeinu felt for all of the Jewish people. To help people also fill the void in their lives, become closer to Hashem, to become closer to our tradition, because it's good for them. It pains us, maybe people lack that connection, and we have to be noble and lead through example, and help our fellow brethren engage with mitzvahs as much as possible. Um, Gives us a sense of elation, we hope. So these are some insights into Parsha Matos-Masei. And we will, Bezrat Hashem, continue. Next year will be in Parsha Devarim, which is also Shabbos Chazon. And Mirtz Hashem, we will have the shiur on the laws of the 3 weeks, specifically whether maybe we make the blessing of Shechianu during this 3-week period. That is a work in progress, and we hope to have that uploaded in the upcoming week. The next shiur that will be out this week will also discuss some of the laws of the 9 days as well as Tisha B'Av. I hope everybody has a wonderful week. Shavua Tov.